So yeah, I'm Ben Van Voorhis. I'm a writer and editor. I've got an MFA in fiction from Eastern Washington. I've had short fiction and essays published in Best Issue Short Stories, Enron, the Baltimore Review, Salamander, the Masters Review, and a few other publications. I've worked as a managing editor for Willow Springs magazine, which publishes short fiction, poetry, and essays. And I've also worked as a reader for the Masters Review, Guernica, and the Catherine A. Porter Prize in Short Fiction. And what I currently do as my day job is I edit a magazine for users of geospatial technology, which is called ArcUser. Less relevant, but it's what I do. The reason I tell you all of that stuff is mostly because I'm here to talk about submitting short work, short creative work, to literary magazines and anthologies. So before I dive into that, I want to do a quick survey. So just by a show of hands, how many of you regularly write short fiction, essays, or poetry? Okay, so a few of you. Fantastic. How many of you have been published in literary magazines or anthologies? Okay, cool. How many of you have submitted to literary magazines and anthologies but have not been published anywhere? Okay, pretty cool. Okay, so how many of you have not submitted anything anywhere but are interested in doing so? Okay, a few people, fantastic. How many of you regularly read literary magazines? That's about what I expected, not very many people. Okay.
Can you define literary magazine?
Yes, yes. So a literary magazine is essentially any, I brought a couple of examples, any book that is published regularly that publishes fiction, short essays, and poetry, often artwork. This one also does artwork. It's called Pinch. Often they're based out of universities. The one that's based out of Eastern Washington is called Willow Springs, and it's a pretty cool publication. And then anthologies that publish work from multiple different people. And so one of the reasons I asked how many people routinely read these is that often this is something that gets kind of written off because one of the main cons of a literary magazine is that not a lot of people read them. A lot of people submit to them, so they're very difficult to get published in, but not a lot of people read them. So the question that I kind of want to start off with addressing is, why do this at all? Why publish in literary magazines? What is the point of this? What is useful about this? Especially if you're somebody who is interested in writing longer form stuff, or if you're interested in self-publishing, you're not as interested in traditional publishing. I still think it's really worth trying to publish your stuff in literary magazines and anthologies. So the first reason is, whether it is fair or not, it adds legitimacy to you as a writer, right? So there is, in traditional publishing, obviously, a lot of gatekeeping. And whether that's fair or not, there's still this veneer of like, okay, if you've been able to get published in this thing, if these professional editors and writers have recognized your work in this way, it's going to add a lot of weight behind you as a writer. And especially if you're interested in self-publishing, you know, some people don't care about this, but for a lot of people, and they look at the back of a book, and they look at an author bio and go, oh, this person has been published here, here, it's going to go like, oh yeah, this person is like, they've been doing this maybe for a long time, they've had already some success, and they might have a little bit more trust in you right off the bat as a writer, right? And as a corollary to that, it looks good on like a CV or a resume. It's a cool thing to be able to say that you've done, and it's good marketing. But to me, one of the things that's even more important is that it's really good practice in terms of getting your work out there. So even if, like I said, you are more interested in writing longer form work and you don't do as much short fiction or poetry, it's still really good practice to, you know, get your stuff out into the world, have it looked at by professional editors, and get some kind of feedback on it, even if the feedback is just, you know, a form of rejection, which is just, hey, thanks, but no thanks, which is the majority of the responses that anyone gets. And the other really good reason is that it's good practice interacting with professional editors in that capacity. So especially for the world of self-publishing, and you can, any one of you who is more experienced in self-publishing than I am can correct me if I'm wrong, but the editing process is probably not as rigid as it is in a lot of traditional publishing environments. And it's really good to get the perspective of people who are like doing this all the time for a specific publication who have an editorial agenda. And the last good reason, I think, to try to get your work in literary magazines and anthologies is that no matter whether you get accepted or not, it's going to provide either a sense of validation, right, if you get accepted, or it can be a reality check for whatever you're working on, right? So if you don't get a lot of bites on a particular story or a particular piece of work, then you might know that you need to do a little bit more work on it, a little bit more revision, all stuff that I think is really worth it. Any questions so far before I move on to the next part? Fantastic. Okay, so is anyone familiar off the top of their heads with any specific literary magazines or anthologies that you know of? What was that?
Analog.
Okay, analog.
Oh, I was going to say fantasy and science fiction.
That's a fantastic one. That's a huge one. Yeah.
Which one?
Fantasy and science fiction.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Chicken soup for the soul.
There is that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do they still have Reader's Digest?
I don't know if Reader's Digest is the same kind of organization. It's like a literary magazine, but I think they're still around.
Baby boomers put out one every year.
Yeah, fantastic. There are a lot of anthologies, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. There are a lot of anthologies that are maybe not necessarily like huge national anthologies, but that do stuff really regularly that are really worth submitting work to.
Yeah, and don't forget about just magazines and newspapers.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to talk about that in a second too. Okay. So yeah, there are tons and tons of these out there. The examples that I've brought, I just picked 3 random ones off my shelf that are new. This one's called The Pinch. This one's called Nimrod, which I have been published in, but not this issue. This is the New Ohio Review. There are like at least 1,000 of these kinds of journals that are coming out like every year, 4 times a year, from really, really talented editorial teams like across the country, and they're putting out such good fiction and poetry that so few people read. And one of the pitches that I want to make, which I wasn't really planning on making, is like, go read literary magazines. There's so much good stuff out there that gets missed. It's really cool. Yeah.
Where do you find them?
So that's a great question. This is what my next section is about. So thank you for the segue there. So
Nice segue.
yeah. So honestly, one of the best ways to find literary magazines is literally just to Google lists of literary magazines. There is one list in particular. So if you are interested in this at all, take down the name Erica Krause, Erika, and then last name Krouse. She's a short fiction writer who publishes an online list of 500 literary magazines that she ranks based on the circulation and how much they pay, and whether the stories out of them have won awards and stuff like that. This is my absolute favorite public resource to find literary magazines. So the thing that she focuses on is literary fiction, literary short fiction. If that's not what you write, that's totally fine. There are similar lists that I'm not as familiar with that are about poetry, that are about genre fiction. She's got a list of genre fiction in there as well. So fantasy and science fiction is a really big one. Clark's World is a really big one that does science fiction. And fantasy and science fiction magazines tend to pay better than most literary magazines. But yeah, so that's a fantastic resource. But one of the really important things in terms of finding these publications is knowing the audience of these publications and knowing what it is that you write. Right, so if the stuff that you write is typically fantasy science fiction, you're going to look for fantasy and science fiction, right? You're going to look at Clark's World. You're going to submit stuff to those kinds of magazines. You're probably not going to submit stuff to the New Yorker because while they have published science fiction in the past, they don't do it very often. All right, so, and then as Sue mentioned, if you happen to write essays, a lot of newspapers and other kinds of magazines take those all the time, and they're really worth submitting to. So even on the local level, like the Inlander, the Spokesman are really good places to send like personal essays to, and they'll take them if they're on a really topic. So how many of you know of or know personally Sharma Shields?
What?
Sharma Shields is a writer.
I know the name.
Okay, so if you are interested in this at all, she works for the Spokane Public Library, and her job is to do the writing programs for the library. And she will, if you email her, she will literally like set up an appointment with you for free and just talk about writing and how to get stuff published and all that kind of stuff. She is the best resource that Spokane has to offer that is writing related at all. Yeah.
What's her name again?
Sharma Shields. She's also a fantastic writer. Not that I'm here to advertise for her, but okay. So yeah, a lot of newspapers, a lot of magazines will publish op-eds, will publish essays. So when you submit short essays, you typically have to pitch them first. Whereas if you submit short fiction or poetry, you're typically submitting the work without, telling the editor what it's about first. So it's a slightly different process, but it's really worth getting in the habit of submitting pitches for various essays, various personal essays. I must have sent like 100 pitches to the Atlantic. They've never published me, but it's really good practice. Okay. And then other local anthologies, as you mentioned, come out all the time. So the one that I'm involved in is anyone familiar with Spark Central? So Spark Central, fantastic nonprofit. They do a lot of really cool stuff. One of the things they do is they put out an anthology of creative work every year. This is the one from last year that I was involved in. It was all about the 50th anniversary of Expo 74. It's got some really cool stuff in here. So that's one of the opportunities that comes up every year. I saw a couple people holding up books. Yeah.
Yeah, that's in Kendall Yard.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah. I may have a vested interest in it because my wife works there. But yeah, so that's a really good resource. I saw a couple people holding up other anthologies. There are so many of these, and they're so worth sending work to, always. Okay. Any questions about that so far?
Why?
What was that?
Why?
Can you?
Is it worth?
So this was what I talked about a little bit before, right? Because I think it's really worth it because you want to put your work out there, because you want to get your name out there. There are a lot of those intangible benefits. There are a lot more tangible benefits, such as a lot of magazines pay. Most of them don't pay very well, but that's if you were getting into creative writing because you wanted the money, then I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing I can do for you. But it is really, really worth getting your name out there. It's really, really worth having that experience. Yeah.
Why do you have to pitch essays? Why can't you just write an essay and send it?
So it depends on the publication. For most publications, they want to have that accept essays. And this is mostly not true of literary magazines, by the way. Most literary magazines, you can just send them an essay, and they will either publish or not. But for publications like, say, the Inlander or the Spokesman Review, so newspapers and magazines that are not literary journals, they want to have a little bit more editorial control over what they publish in their magazines. So they will ask you to essentially send them an idea first so that they can okay it or not, because if they don't okay it, then you don't have to write it. They want to be able to be a part of the editorial process in a way that most literary magazines typically don't need to be. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna, that nice article they wrote about the activity at Antes next year, and they published a picture of the people that were participating from this group. Cindy Ball wrote it, and she had to pitch it, and she writes for the Review all the time.
Yeah.
So that's not unusual.
Yeah, it's really common practice for most newspapers and other similar publications, like weekly or monthly periodicals. But for literary magazines that are more dedicated to all right, we want to publish art, then typically you don't need to publish or to pitch the work that you're submitting beforehand. Any other questions before I move on to the next section? Okay, so the last and I think most important thing that I want to talk about is if you are in fact interested in this. If you're not, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about that. But if you are in fact interested in submitting your work, here are some things to keep in mind when you do that. So the first thing is it's a numbers game. So to be really frank, I've worked on every side of this, right? I have submitted to literary magazines, I've been published in literary magazines, I've edited them, I've read slush for them. Is anyone not familiar with the term slush?
No, I'm not.
Okay, fantastic. So the slush pile is basically any publication has a group of submissions that have been sent to them unsolicited, and that's referred to as the slush pile. So most literary magazines, the stuff that they publish is pulled from a slush pile, and so they'll have a group of readers that are kind of the first line, and they'll read through the slush pile, and if they give it a positive response, it'll go on to the next level of editor, and then on and on and up. This is how most literary magazines do it. So I've worked as a slush reader. I've worked as an editor for these magazines, and I will be frank and tell you that about 75% of what literary magazines get is absolute crap. It's just terrible stuff. So if you can go above that 75%, you're doing fantastic. The problem is that remaining 25% of submissions is really, really good. And so there's so much really, really good stuff out there, even submitted to just the smallest, dinkiest magazines out there get just the absolute best writing submitted to them. And you still have to be better than that 25% to get accepted in most of these magazines, which makes it really, really hard, which brings us back to the question of why is this worth it? And that's going to be a personal thing, but for the reasons that I said, I still think it is. So, because it is a numbers game, it's really, really worthwhile to keep really careful track of what you're submitting where. If I had thought about this beforehand, I would have tried to get this projected, but I did want to show you from very far away, and if you're interested, you can comment, but I can show you after. The thing that I use to track all of my submissions. So I've got this handy dandy spreadsheet that's very long and has just a list of everything that I've submitted everywhere.
My goodness.
And yeah, if you want to take a closer look at that, or if you want me to send it to you, I totally can if it's helpful at all. So that's really worth doing in terms of making sure you know who has what, when submissions open. And one of the things that I do is every time somebody sends me a rejection, if they have a submission period that's open, I just turn around and send them another story. Because the more I send out, the higher a likelihood it is that somebody will take something. So it's sort of a crapshoot in a lot of ways, but that's what it is. Okay, so the other thing that you want to keep in mind is to know what your goals are for your own writing, and where you want to get published and why, right? So this is, if you're interested in this practice at all, this is why it's really good to read literary magazines beyond the fact that stuff that they're publishing is really fantastic. It gives you a better sense of which literary magazines you really like, right? So, everybody who is routinely submitting to literary journals wants to get published in the New Yorker because everybody knows what it is. It's a huge magazine. It's really, really hard to get into. But when you are reading a lot more of them, you start to discover ones that are a little bit more under the radar. How many people here have heard of the magazine Ninth Letter?
Okay, are you saying ninth? I'm part of your.
Yeah, Ninth Letter.
Ninth as in the ninth number.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I expected. It's a magazine that's published by, I want to say the University of Illinois. It's one of my absolute favorite literary magazines. It's so cool. They're always putting out such good work. It's so well designed. I can't believe I didn't bring an issue with me today, but I'm not that prepared. But if you are researching this stuff and reading those magazines more widely, you start to figure out which ones you go oh, I really like this. I really like the stuff that's appearing in there. And if it's in line with the stuff that you're writing, then you know where to submit to. And obviously that's something that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of reading from a lot of different places. But it's such a cool world to dive into. Okay, yes.
If yours doesn't get in, how do you know whether to revise it or just send it somewhere else? And if you do need to revise you recommend people who can help you with that?
That's a fantastic question that does not have an easy answer, unfortunately, because the vast majority of the time you get a story or a piece rejected from a magazine, they're going to send a form rejection. So they're just going to send you like a copy paste, like, thanks for sending this, we're not taking it. Every once in a while, most magazines have like tiers of rejections. So they'll have one that says thanks but no thanks, and then they'll have one that says, hey, we really enjoyed reading this, send us something else, which is always really nice to get, but they're still not taking it. And so typically what I do personally is if I have a story that I send out to, say, 30 places, and none of them want it, and I'm getting a whole bunch of form rejections, then maybe I start to go, okay, maybe this could use some work, maybe I could revise this. And the best people that you're gonna have to be able to look over your work are people who you know personally, who are also writers, whose work you admire, and who understand what you're doing. You can always hire professional developmental editors. There are plenty of people who do that freelance. I imagine there are some people in this room who do that. But I have found that if you really want your work to be the best version of itself, finding readers who you know and trust, who you can exchange work with, is always going to be the best way to revise, right? Because they understand what you're doing, you understand what they're doing, they can give you the best suggestions because they get where you're coming from. Does that help?
Sort of, but, like Writer's Digest, they have second draft.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever used that? Do you think that's
I haven't.
what they do?
Yeah, so I can't speak to a lot of those kinds of things just because I'm a really big believer in, relying on the community of writers that's around you. Like I said, there are a lot of people who perform and sell editing services who are probably really, really good at what they do. I'm an editor. I like to think that I'm pretty good at what I do, but when I'm getting other people to make suggestions on my work, I'm typically not sending that out to professional services, right? I'm sending that out to friends who are writers whose work I know and who I trust. Yeah.
Well, but the thing is, you're an editor,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of us aren't.
Yeah.
We could use help.
Yeah, and this is the hard part, right? So if you, it's always going to be different for every person. If you feel like it is in your best interest to hire an editor for your work, then if you know somebody who's good, then definitely do that. I know a couple people around town who do freelance editing. I know, Sue, you do freelance editing. Like I said, I'm sure there are other people in this room who do it who are very good at it. So, those are things to look into. If anyone here wants some recommendations for freelance editors, let me know and I can give you a couple names. Even if you are not an editor, even if you are not interacting with other editors, there is something about having somebody whose work you trust and being able to trust their editorial eye that you are the best judge of because it's your way, And I know that's not really a satisfying answer because you kind of want right, who's the best editor who's going to help you with this? But I really believe that the best editor who can help you with any of your projects is somebody whose editorial eye you know and somebody who gets what you're doing. So sorry if that's not a super satisfying answer for that one. Okay, so I have a couple other best practices before I close out for submitting work to literary magazines or anywhere. So number one, don't put all of your eggs in one basket. So I mentioned the New Yorker earlier. Everybody wants to get published in the New Yorker. If you send a story to the New Yorker and you're like, I'm going to wait to hear back from them before I send it anywhere else, you're going to be waiting a long time because they don't get back to people for like a year. And so it's even if you are worried about okay, well, I want to get a piece in this magazine, but they're not going to get back to me for a while, so I want to hear what they say. I think personally, I still believe it's a better practice to submit as widely as you possibly can right off the bat. Just send stuff out to anywhere that you like, that you think the work fits in. Here are a couple things that might sound really obvious, so apologies if they're super obvious, but I want to say them anyway because this is something that editors run into all the time. Always read the guidelines for anything that you're submitting to. They're always going to have word counts. They're always going to have, sometimes they'll have subject guidelines, sometimes they'll have themes. Always make sure that you are submitting the right thing to the right place. Another super obvious one, make sure your piece has gone through some level of editing, right? Whether you are sending it to somebody professional or whether you're having a peer edit it, make sure that you've done a spell check. There are so many really interesting submissions that come through literary magazines that get written off because they've got typos, because they've got poor grammar, because things are phrased a little bit weirdly. It's just it's worth it to do the last copywriting pass. Another one that might be obvious: don't get cute with fonts. Editors really, really hate weird fonts. Anything that is as standard as you can possibly make it, like 12-point Times New Roman. You want to let the writing speak for itself as much as you possibly can. Here's one that I think is sort of interesting. Unless you're pitching something to a magazine or another publication that requires you to pitch something, cover letters don't matter. So most literary magazines ask you to submit a cover letter. They don't. Slush readers almost never read these. They basically don't matter at all. So don't spend too much effort on those. And either way, the shorter it is, the better it's going to be. The more concise you can make those. So here's another one. Slush readers go through all this stuff really, really fast. And I'm sure this is familiar writing advice to a lot of you, but especially with short fiction, if you can hook somebody in the first page, preferably the first few sentences, and if you have an angle, and you can make sure you have something unexpected or surprising, whether it's in the language or whether it's in what's happening, it's going to make that reader read on a little bit farther than they normally would have. So, on that note, there are a lot of topics that do and don't work for most editors for literary magazines. Funny is good. Humor is really, really hard. And as somebody who's read Slush for these, I know that you get a lot of really self-serious stories that are like, I'm a struggling writer and I'm going to college and I'm going to tell you about my struggles as a writer in college. And when you read 1,000 of those, it's like, I don't need anymore. And for nonfiction, it's very sad, but you get a million submissions that are a parent in the hospital or a dead pet, and it's like, this might be a story that's worth telling, but unless you have a really specific angle that feels fresh, there's not an editor that's going to take it, right? So if you have those really familiar topics, you have to make sure that you're approaching them in a way that editors are like, oh, this is something that's a little bit different. This is a little bit fresh. And when it comes to genre fiction, when it comes to writing fantasy sci-fi, there are so many submissions that are just like, here, let me give you this overview of this really interesting sci-fi world concept. Those editors see thousands of those. They don't want another one, right? Or if they do, they want it to have some extra bit that's going to help them. And the last thing that I want to reiterate is the most important thing is just to know the publications and know their audience, which again requires a lot of time. And sometimes it feels like more effort than it's worth, but I think that effort is just really good practice as a writer. It's a really good practice as a self-editor, and it can help you get published if that's something that you're interested in doing. Get your short story published. Okay, any questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah, go for it.
It's just what you went through sounds like when you teach people how to write resumes. It's the same process.
Honestly, yeah, because and the really interesting thing about literary magazines is that they're really concerned with the art of it for the most part. They're really concerned with what is the stuff that we're going to... Let me tell you something though, that one of my editors told me once that has always really stuck with me, which is that the best short fiction and the worst short fiction often looks really similar. Because the best stuff is taking risks. You're doing stuff that other people who are writing the same kind of stuff are not going to be doing. And so it might at first glance look like, what is this person doing? But then as you read it, you start to understand that the risk is kind of paying off. And I think the same is true for a lot of resumes. It's like you might take a risk, sometimes it doesn't pan out, sometimes it does. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think the same is true for applying to a lot of things, whether it's a job or submitting to a newspaper or something. If you make yourself stand out in the right way, then you're going to have a better chance, right? Yeah.
What do you think of submittable? Is that too narrow of a field?
So submittable, like the platform, the online platform.
Yeah.
So submittable is like industry standard for submitting work almost anywhere. Most literary magazines use submittable. There are a few that have their own dedicated submission platforms, but it is worth having a submittable account if you're going to be submitting short work, because almost everybody uses it.
What is that?
So yeah, submittable.
I'm the only one that
Yeah.
knows this.
That's a good question. Submittable is an online platform that's basically exclusively for submitting work places. And so you can just make a free online account that you can use to submit work to magazines. If you are on the other end, if you're an editor, you have to pay to set up that. But if you're just submitting work, you don't have. It's totally free. So if you're interested in submitting short work and you don't have a submittable account, definitely make one, because most places use it. Yeah.
How does that work if you put something up on your submittable account? Does everybody see it that looks at submittable, or do you have to target certain people?
No, so submittable is totally private. So basically, it's not a publishing platform in and of itself. It's literally just a way for you to send stuff to magazines and editors.
Yeah, well, that's what I was asking. Do the editors, when they go to their submittable account, do they see everything that's there?
Yeah. So it depends. So on the editing end, if you are the managing editor of a magazine, say, you'll be able to see all of the submissions in there. Some of the slush readers might only be able to see what's assigned to them. So it really depends on the magazine. A lot of them run it a little bit differently. Yeah.
I've used it before, and got my share of rejections, which is fine.
Yeah.
That's always good. And it's really easy to use, I think.
Yeah, it's incredibly intuitive,
Yeah.
I think. It's not surprising. Yeah.
And I've used it with Writer's Digest to submit self-published books for the Self-Published Book Award,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a fee attached with it. How much of that is submittable? How much of it is Writer's Digest?
So it's typically all going to be on the publication that you're submitting to. So I thank you for asking this, because I totally should have covered this. Most places, most literary magazines do require a small submission fee. The standard is about $3. Sometimes if you're submitting to a contest, it might be like $10 or $20, because they use that to fund whatever the prize is. But typically, I don't remember what the cut is that submittable takes. It might be like 40% or something like that. But that money is used directly in most cases to fund the magazine that you're submitting to, which is how I justify to myself spending so much money submitting work. Because I want to support these magazines, because a lot of them are really struggling because they're based out of universities and they don't have any money. But yeah, so most times you submit places, it's going to require a fee. Most places also have a fee waiver option, and some places have slightly higher or slightly lower fees. I know there's a magazine that's got like a $20 fee for every submission, and it's ridiculous, and I would never submit there. Anyway, yeah. Any questions? All right, so that is all I had for you. If you have any other questions about publishing, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I do. Again, dealing with Writer's Digest,
Mm-hmm.
I've been taking it for decades, and I am writing a book now that I want to use some quotes from the magazine. I have contacted the magazine, and it's I just got an email today, because they responded that they wanted to know what specific quotes, and the attribution. So
Yeah.
I sent that to them, and it's been forwarded as of today to the editorial staff. My question is this: if I don't get permission to use the exact quote, can I legally paraphrase what's spoken there?
Probably. I'm also not the right person to ask about it, just to be.
I'm not sure there's a right person.
Yeah, I think that would be a question for like an intellectual property lawyer. But I imagine you'd be probably fine if you're paraphrasing something. Typically, and this is again, don't take my word for this. Double check me on this. But so in my job, I often will quote press releases and stuff like that. And typically, as long as you attribute the quote properly, you'll be fine. But asking for permission first is probably the way to go. So.
Okay, and if you do paraphrase it, are you still attributing
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
same way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
And I mean, that's in academic writing, we are taught that you can paraphrase, and then you
still have to cite your sources,
You
yeah.
still have to cite your source, and then you should be okay.
Yeah, as far as I know, that's the case. But don't take my word for that. Yeah.
I thought if you, quote something exactly, if you, footnote it and cite the source.
It depends on the. This is getting way far away from what I was expecting to talk. It depends on the format, right? So most publishers will follow a specific style guide. So if they're using like the Chicago manual style, they might do one particular way. If they're using AP style, they might do it a slightly different way. So sometimes it might be footnoted, sometimes it might not be. It really depends on the style guide that they're following. Yeah.
usually they provide those to you, the style guide, what they want you to, how they want you to write your article.
So, depending on the publication, so I'll speak, for example, for the publication that I edit for my magazine, I'll have submission guidelines for anyone who submits. They will have to go through that page and read it and then submit something. None of them read it, and so what I do is on the back end, I end up doing all that stuff myself, and then it'll go through our copy editing department. So for my work, all that stuff gets handled on the back end. And usually, if we're talking a literary magazine, the same will be true too. So for Willow Springs, what we typically did was we would not take a piece unless we were comfortable taking it as is, because if we wanted to make any edits, we wanted to run them past the author. And if they said no to anything that was really crucial, we wouldn't want to take it. So we would basically not take anything that was not done. However, once we took it, we would say, okay, here are some suggested edits, and also we would go through a really intensive copy editing process where we would sit around a table for like 8 hours and argue about commas. So typically that's a process that most of these journals go through as well. And we use the Chicago manual style. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
I noticed, a while ago you were talking about talking to your friends and people that you trust about your writing, if you feel like it needs some help. And I have found that critique groups really work well for that.
Yes, 100%. If you are somebody who writes regularly, who does this basically on any level of seriousness, and you are not part of a writing group, find a writing group to be a part of, because that's so incredibly helpful. I'm part of a writer group that is, I think, meeting tomorrow, and we all read each other's work. We all know each other's work really well. And it's really good not only to get that editorial feedback, but also to provide some level of accountability to make sure that we're all writing and we're all taking it seriously. I find that very valuable.
What is your magazine?
So the one that I edit is not a literary magazine. It's called Arc User. It's a trade magazine that's for users of geospatial technology, so like mapping software. So that's my day job. But we go through a lot of similar processes as I have when I worked on literary magazines. All right, any other questions, thoughts, queries, concerns? Yeah.
Can you say something about the public domain?
I don't think so, but do you have a question about it?
Well, it's kind of hard to define what is in it and what it's not.
I think it's, if anybody knows this off the top of their head, feel free to correct me. I don't think I'm connected to the internet, but I think it's, there's a certain year before which everything that was published during that time is now in the public domain. I think at this point it's like 19, 20-something. Anything before that is in the public domain. And then there's a certain period of time that a copyright can be renewed, after which it can remain privately owned, and if not, it will fall into the public domain, and it can be used or attributed, no matter what. But I don't know all that much about it, so.
There's a way to look it up too on some things.
Yeah.
If you have a specific thing, you can look to see if it's in the public domain.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend doing, is if you're wondering about something specific. Yeah, that's also not a question that I'm the right person to ask about.
Santa Claus is in the public domain. You can write about it.
Probably, I would imagine that's true. Yeah.
What was that literary magazine you said, the ninth something?
Ninth Letter. Ninth Letter. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. I'm really partial to that one. I think that one's very cool. So the cool thing about that journal in particular is it's a collaboration between, I can't remember the college that it's based out of, but it's a collaboration between their creative writing department and their design department. So it's the way the journal itself is designed is like really elaborate, and they've got some really cool stuff in there.
And then the one that you mentioned sounded to me like pinch, is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what that is.
P-I-N-C-H, okay.
Yeah, this is the University of Memphis, I think, publishes this. Yeah, and this one's always got some really cool stuff in there. And then there are a ton of these that I can recommend to you if you want like a list of them. I should have come up with a list of them. Yeah, and if you're interested again in checking out like my submission spreadsheet that I use to track everything, I'm totally happy to send that to anyone or just show it to you if you think that'll be helpful. All right. Any last questions? Okay, yeah, so that's all I had for you, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For all those who are interested, the ninth letter is I.